And we're back with more Xbox action. This time the Series X and the Series S get a little bit more love from Microsoft's Backwards Compatibility team, and their long-running FPS boost program has now hit full stride. Earlier this week they released another 70-something titles, giving almost 100 games that now boost that frame rate from its previous 30 or 60 FPS and double it up to 60 or 120 respective of the title. Now, not all these games run on the Series S, but they do all run on the Series X at least, and we do see some substantial improvements. Now, the first thing, I've covered this in depth, how they do this, how it works, what the construction is, so please go check out my previous FPS boost video from a couple of months back where I talked about this in a little more depth. The short version is, generally games can be synced to the VSync refresh rate, and then you trick that in the operating system to tell it it's running rather than 60, it's running at 120, and therefore it doubles it at half refresh. That is what we're seeing here. Now, many of these titles will perform at a lower resolution when they're running at the higher refresh rate. Now, some of them don't work on the Series S, that's the first thing to discuss, and some of them don't run at all in a higher resolution mode that they do on the Xbox One X, for example. Now, unlike the previous test where I could test a lot of the games by tricking it and jumping out of the FPS boost, going back into it again when you kick the game off, getting it at 4K, and then forcing on that FPS boost when the game is resumed, they've patched that out now in the operating system. As I knew they would, it was a mistake that was there. I covered it. You now can't do it. I have tried. It doesn't work. They've taken it totally out. So you are forced into picking your poison. Do you want performance or pixels? 30, 60, or even 120 FPS. And that's perfect. That's right, because that means we, the player, get to choose which is best for us. And that's the perfect substitute to having these options in the menu and be able to play these games in the format you want. Pick the blue pill or the red pill.
You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
So what are we looking at here? A collection of titles. I can't cover them all obviously, but I've covered a good selection to give you an idea of the performance levels and just what you can expect from these new games. Now, there is one here that's a special standout for me, one of my favourite titles of the generation in terms of last generation. I loved it, finished it multiple times. Now, Yakuza 6 is a good one to start with because it supports both Series S and Series X, and that's because it's a 1080p 30 game, no matter which console you run it on, or at least the Xbox One X version is, and now it runs at 1080p 60 on both consoles. So this allows us to test both console versions, that 4 teraflop Series S and that 12 teraflop Series X. And as you would imagine, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. This isn't a heavily stressful title when it's got that much power to run, but it can have a few more dips on the Series S. One thing to note is you can check some of these titles run, the FPS boost is running by going into the game on the menu and seeing that the tick button's done, or the quickest way is if you just press the home button whilst you're playing the game, underneath the clock you'll see that plus FPS boost icon. Not every game defaults this option on, so just be aware of that. If it's got an Xbox One X enhanced version such as Battlefront or Battlefield 5, then you have to go and turn this on. It still defaults to the 4K 60 mode. So taking Yakuza 6 as a first example, here on the Series X, there's something specific to talk about. If you do a lot of resume state, so back to other games, you don't shut the console down, you put it in a quick startup mode, it can cause performance issues from time to time. I've had this before, mentioned it multiple times. It can happen on other consoles as well, PS5, PS4, I know sometimes it can happen. Be aware of it. I did have a little issue here, and I had it again in Alien Isolation, where I got some long stutters and hangs. It looks like an operating system call here to the trophy award that I get because I've ran into this battle with the drink power still on, and it gives me an award, and it causes that stutter and hangs for a few seconds down to 0 FPS and then resumes again. So this doesn't happen all the time, and I restarted and retested some of these games again. It didn't happen again, so just bear that in mind. Now, other than that, the Series X does have a couple of skips. Now, these only happen, again, they're inherent to the game code and nothing to do with the actual power of the console being utilised and all of that. It's just when you go into battle and you power up, you have that little flick to like a cutscene cinematic where you smash the A and Y button, kind of a QTE from Shenmue style. Now, that drives that impact section out, and it can cause a little skip into 60-80 milliseconds. It's slightly longer on the Series S than it is on the Series X, but aside this, the Series X is fully locked. Still 1080p, still quite shimmery in terms of the aliasing on the title, but overall there are some nice textures and some nice details in the title, certainly out in the cityscape. The animation's a bit wooden on the game itself, but it is that modern day Shenmue title we always dreamed of, and it's been going for so long now that it kind of feels part of the furniture in terms of console titles. Now, the Series S is very similar. It does have a few dips below 50 FPS. It can get as low as the mid-40s at certain heavier battles, so it's definitely GPU bound in some of these sections. Again, this Yakuza engine is very, very stressful. It's known to be quite impactful in terms of performance, so it's still a good result, but you can see here in combat with lots of particle effects, alpha effects as you're combating multiple enemies, it can judder. And it's got the same issue that I said before. When it flicks into those QTE sections, you can get 80, 90 millisecond spikes, and then sometimes when you're going out of a battle or going into a battle, it has a little stutter in the engine. Again, a lot of this is just inherent to the code. It's got nothing to do with the hardware that it's running on. But overall, it's still much better, much smoother, and more performant than it ever was on any of the previous Xbox consoles, or indeed the PlayStation consoles. And again, this is a free benefit, a free boost to that original title, and therefore it's still a lot of fun to play. If you like some of that comedic Japanese format, it really does work well. One thing to note here is obviously these titles that are boosted to 60 FPS still have 30 FPS cutscenes, just like they do here on Yakuza. These are movie files. You can't change those. They still render at the same rate. Nothing will change that. So they do stand out a little more obvious here, but it's a very minor and small price to pay for that significant boost in performance. And talking of that, we can see a significant boost in performance in our next title, Battlefield 5. Now, this doesn't have a Series S version because it's obviously too much for that console to push it at 120 FPS even at 1080p. So this only runs on the Series X, and we can target the one on the left is running at 1080 120, and the one on the right is running at 4K 60. And as you can see, performance is rock solid. In this opening section, I could not find a drop. I tested some later sections as well, and it's pretty much as solid as you would expect. Now, that's not a massive surprise, as in terms of bandwidth and pixel fill rate, obviously 120 1080p is lower than 60 FPS at 4K. Obviously, you're getting 8 million pixels every 16 milliseconds, whereas you're only getting 4 million pixels every 16 milliseconds at 120. So it's half the fill rate, half the bandwidth required to run at 120. So, albeit, by and large, it should be the same. Now, that's not consistent across everything, because obviously running a game at 120 FPS means you only have half the time to do all the other stuff in terms of your geometry, your skinning, all your CPU calculations. So all of that, is still fixed in terms of cost overall for drawing the frame, your draw calls. So there's still a massive amount more that a console or PC has to do to run at 120 FPS. But in terms of GPU load, if you significantly drop the resolution, like we're seeing here, it's 4 times larger resolution at 4K, then that does alleviate some of the stressful sections. So like I say, this is one of those titles where I would love to have tested it at 4K, because I think somewhere around, probably 1260p, 1440p, it still would have been a pretty consistent 120 FPS title. There's probably quite a little bit of headroom left over in terms of this particular title, and certainly Battlefront, but that has some more dips in the multiplayer section, as this title does as well. But overall, it's still a very solid performing title, and as you can see, even though the image quality impact is obvious when you're looking at them side by side, once you're playing the game and you're getting twice the amount of frames in the same time, you're still getting a much higher resolution than you would running it at 1080 60. So it still managed to look a lot sharper and a lot cleaner, and you do get those performance in input times, which I've covered in depth in a previous video. You can go and check that out to dig into it more. So here, just giving you some quick examples. You can see a graph on screen using this particular, the DICE and the Frostbite engine here. Looking at Battlefront 2, you can see it goes from 60 FPS at a worst point of 102 milliseconds, a median of 86 milliseconds, and then that can go right down to 65 milliseconds or 86 as a high. So that's around 20 milliseconds benefit there. So the highest point is as high as the median that we got at 60 FPS. But Battlefield 5 here, it's not quite as big a delta. It's around 8 to 9 milliseconds, so 1 frame benefit overall. And then right at the very bottom, you can see the significant boost you get from running it on the Xbox One S, which is still a 60 FPS title at a much lower resolution. You're still getting slightly higher highs on that one than you did overall. But the game, like many games, it can vary quite significantly. 8 to 16 millisecond differences at times between the best you get in input times and the worst you get. So a lot of these games can vary and fluctuate around the area, so look at somewhere in between those two figures as the average you would tend to get more often than not. This is a small section of tests, but overall 120 FPS games are better for input times than they are for refresh times on the screen. The leap from 30 to 60 is far bigger than the leap from 60 to 120, as I've said before, but again, you can't ignore these kind of benefits when they come knocking at your door.
Princess Organa is here. Incapacitate her. Signal from command. We have an elite operative on site.
Next up on the list is a big one, Metro Exodus. Oh, sorry, not Metro Exodus, Metro 2033 and its sequel, Metro Last Light. Now, this again is a title that I covered way back when I started my channel, or at least a couple of years after I started it, which I reviewed in depth, this updated Redux version, and it's superb. 60 FPS, it runs around 912p, 900p on the Xbox One, and this is the same version you get here, it's the same resolution, but now rather than running at 60, it runs at 120, and it runs on both the Xbox Series X and Series S, and as you can see here, the Series S of Metro 2033 is pretty much a locked 120 FPS. There's a couple of dips here and there, but again, like I said before, they're 8 milliseconds. You're never going to feel those in a game that's consistently hitting 8 milliseconds more often than not. Dropping to 16 milliseconds for a frame here or there, it's just insignificant. Outside of this kind of frame rate graph, you would never notice the dips. And it's really consistent, feels really smooth, but then it always did, and it's a nice boost and benefit. And like I said before, you'll get that increase in input times and latency over the standard 60 FPS mode, so it feels that little bit smoother and that little bit fresher to play. And Last Light is exactly the same here on Series X. It performs a locked 120 FPS. I didn't find a dip at all in about 8 or 9 minutes of tested sections here, varying between running up and down, shooting people, sneaking through, lots of lights and torches and shadows, and all of the things that would stress the engine out. If it's going to dip, it's going to dip more on the Series S, but as you can see with the 2033, it really is a consistent title on both machines, and it's a nice free boost to that performance of a lock-slide 60 FPS now going double at 120. So if you do want to dip into some Last Light or some Metro 2033 before you dip into that beautifully ray traced version that's just landed on PC, I've just downloaded yesterday, then this is a great way to get back into the title and refresh yourself before you go into the Exodus.
Do like I do. Into the car.
Continuing the theme of 120 FPS boosts, DICE is back with Frostbite again in Mirror's Edge Catalyst. This time 120 FPS is available on both Xbox Series S and Series X. Tested here on the Series X, as you'd expect, it holds on to 120 FPS pretty much 99.9% of the time. Obviously, those cutscenes, those movie sections in the title that are 30 FPS, they still jump in, and obviously some of the cinematics that are real time, they also can dip, and that's because this is a good example of things that are hard-coded in the engine, which I mentioned in my previous video. This one's a good example. So motion and any kind of geometry movement is all rendered at the refresh rate of the game. So once it goes to 120, then character animation and skinning and all that runs at 120. But camera locomotion, so the frustum view when it's in cinematics, that can cause these dips here, and that's because it's actually running at 30 FPS still when the camera moves. So if no one's moving in the scene, the game is 30 FPS and it goes back up to 120. You can see the judder there as the camera moves over his head, and that's why the cameras are juddering, because it's moving every 4 frames rather than moving every 1 frame, and that makes the game look a little bit bit jittery, but once you're in action running around, it's pretty much a lock solid 120 FPS. It doesn't dip. It's still the same 1600 by 900p resolution as it was on the Xbox One. It still looks very soft. The textures are still very blurry at certain points, and it uses lots of screen space reflections all over the place, almost like a modern look of a ray tracing title that will go mad with reflections. But they're very good. They're stochastic. There's lots of different materials in the title, but it's got a very distinct look to it. Very bright, very vibrant colours with incredibly strong ambient occlusion, so everything looks very dark and edgy. But overall, it's a nice aesthetic and it's fun to play. But the parkour system, the animation, the momentum that the game gives when you're playing in that first-person camera does look very convincing. And overall, like the original 2008 release, it's still a breath of fresh air to play, to beat your own scores and enjoy that combat and that locomotion system.
There's a dead drop at the marker on your map.
This is bullshit, man. You should be looking for a way off.
Are you crazy? There's no way off. At least we're safe down here.
For how long? What if they come for us?
Then we shoot the crap out of
The
them.
last game for today is by far the biggest for me and the most enjoyable, one that I've played multiple times. I absolutely adore Alien Isolation. I think it's one of Creative Assembly's, if not Sega's, best releases ever. Nothing comes close to capturing the feeling of that original 70s Alien film, that feeling of claustrophobia, fear, uncertainty, lack of trust, helplessness that the game and the film portrayed. This captures it perfectly, alongside that mixture of that old retro futuristic look that the film had with old CRT screens and green screens and VDUs and the flashing screens. In fact, even the puzzle sections when you have to hack through doors reminds me of designing sprites in the old Commodore 64. Everything about the title is made with love, care and attention, and it's a love note to the original period, time and material, from the grainy tracking bar at the bottom of the map screen to the flickery VHS style cutscenes, or the screens in the game that flicker in and out, the choppy soundtrack, or the way it uses that beautiful bokeh shaped depth of field when you're holding the tracker and you can flip back and forth between foreground and background as you work. It's just an absolutely superb experience to play. If you haven't played it, it's my recommendation, one of the best horror science fiction games ever made. And the overall sound design that is absolutely exemplary. This game with 3D sound, it works now, you know, putting the headphones on and that dialogue, but having this in a VR mode would be absolutely stupendous. It's a shame it's one of the early games that used the Kinect as well, where you could actually move your head and make noise in the actual game and it would listen to you in the room. So if you made noise, it would actually come and find you, the alien. The fact that it tracks you and all of that works so intrinsically in the gameplay is brilliant. Go and check out my original review of the title where, you know, talked about it in 2014, I think, when it came out. I'm a massive fan of the Alien H.R. Geiger's work anyway, so generally this is just a standout, but I don't think anyone's come close to capturing the brilliance of this title. And now performance is absolutely superb. It did have some issues originally at 30 FPS, even on the Xbox One and the PS4. It could judder at certain points. All of those issues are gone. The only caveat there is, obviously, as I said before, make sure you reboot your system. You don't have it in resume state, because this is one of the titles that did have some lag, some judder at certain points on my Series X. But again, once I rebooted it and restarted it, I had no issues at all, as you can see on screen. Completely locked 60 FPS. The game has so much atmosphere and feeling, and it feels great to play. The fact that it mixes up the kind of, you know, traversal, puzzle solving, working through the story, dodging people. You're very helpless in this title, but slowly but surely you work through all the arsenal to try and use it against the enemy and the alien, and you hide from it, and everything works so intrinsically well that it really just, every time I play it, I just love playing it. I haven't played it for a couple of years, so it's great to get back into it and play it again. And now that you get a fully locked 60 FPS, it's still the same 1920 by 1080p that it was on the Xbox One X, but that's no bad thing. Yes, it's got a lot of shimmer because it uses a lot of specular and a lot of contrasting sections. It's a very dark and bright game, so without any temporal AA there, but it still looks very clean and sharp for a 1080p game. You just have to get through that shimmer, but it's all worth it for now that you get it at 60 FPS on both consoles. Again, the only minor point to note is the fact that the movie sequences are run at 24 FPS or 25 frames per second, and they're inconsistent. Their frame pacing is all over the place, so they do feel even worse now, going from a smooth 60 to this 24, 25 FPS section. But again, they're very brief, and still they add a lot of atmosphere, and I do like them because they just add that general aesthetic that the original Alien film had. As you can tell, I'm a big fan.
Locked tight. They're goddamn androids. They're killing people.
That's impossible. It's contrary to primary synthetic programming.
I've seen it, Samuels. I guess Seegson's got a different idea about synthetics.
There's many others. You can see a quick list on screen of all the 97 titles that are now available in this FPS boost mode, and I'm sure there's much more to come. And a big thumbs up to Xbox and generally just adding that value to these two consoles. Like I say, the only thing at the moment is, for me, the Series S generally makes more sense from a budget perspective. If you have another console or a PC, the Series S is just bang on because you get all the benefits of a Series X, bar a few titles that you can't run at 120 FPS, but generally you still get all the benefits of it for a much cheaper price. But if you are going to dip in and you do like horror, then I highly recommend Alien Isolation. Anyway, that's it. As always, I'm out, but remember, I am completely self-funded and independent, and I do this as a part-time thing. So please, if you can help, like, subscribe, comment below, all that good stuff. And if you can afford it, a few pounds or dollars over on my Patreon really helps, because I do all this for free, and YouTube isn't really the most beneficial of making money. This isn't about the money. This is just about making sure I can continue making this. And some of the other things that I've been out in the works for a while that I think are beneficial, it's hard to do that when you just don't get that revenue from YouTube. Anyway, that's it, doing a little bit of spiel and spell. If you have played any of these or anything else on the list that you saw, then please put the comments down below and let me know if there's anything else you want me to test or anything that really stands out as a good or bad example of how this all works. Anyway, I'll see you very soon on the next one.